Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always said, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
When I pitched this lecture to Dr. Robeson at the beginning of last semester, Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine yet, and President Biden certainly wasn't warning the nation that Putin isn't joking about using nuclear weapons in Europe. Biden has assessed the nuclear risk and claims that it's the highest it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. These recent developments are terrifying, but also reinforce my argument that nobody talks about the 1983 nuclear war scare, not even the President of the United States. When we think about the Cold War, we usually think about things like McCarthyism, the Red Scare, Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, or Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech, and the Berlin Wall coming down. But when we think about nuclear brinkmanship, we typically only think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. At least that's how it was for me before I took Dr. Soché's Cold War summer class. Mixed in with the countless chapters, articles, and videos was a PBS documentary about Able Archer 83, which I hadn't even heard of. I didn't know it then, but that documentary would change the entire trajectory of my academic career. To really understand the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the Able Archer 83 incident, at least for the sake of this lecture, we need to go back to 1969. In 1969, the United States and the Soviet Union began a series of talks which later became known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, also known as SALT. By May of 1972, the US and the USSR came to an interim agreement, and President Richard Nixon and General Secretary Brezhnev signed the SALT I Treaty. This treaty was incredibly significant because it was the first agreement between America and the Soviet Union to limit nuclear arms. It symbolized hope for cooperation between the enemy superpowers, the actual manifestation of detente before their very eyes. Due to the interim nature of SALT II, the talks quickly resumed in November of 1972. And by November of 1974, the United States and Soviet Union had laid out the framework for SALT II, a more comprehensive and longer-lasting treaty. The first agreed upon element limited strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, which includes intercontinental ballistic missiles, heavy bombers, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And this limit was 2,400. It also limited independently targetable re-entry vehicle systems to 1,320. The treaty was intended to last until about 1985, and it also planned to limit the deployment of new forms of strategic offensive warheads. With all of this in mind, it seemed like a high point for Soviet-American relations, until it wasn't. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, which prompted President Jimmy Carter to pull the treaty before the Senate could ratify it. And just like that, the glimmer of hope began to fade, the arms race continued, and tensions between Soviets and Americans rose. If the failure of SALT II instigated the beginning of the end for détente, the election of Ronald Reagan delivered the final blow. Before his political career, Reagan made a name for himself as a Hollywood actor, and it was during this time that his deep-rooted hatred for communism and communist sympathizers began to really take off. McCarthyism hit Hollywood almost as hard as it hit the federal government. And this anti-communist crusade spoke to Reagan, who had once said, Joseph Stalin had set out to make Hollywood an instrument of propaganda for his program of Soviet expansionism aimed at communizing the world. Reagan wholeheartedly believed that the communist plan for Hollywood was remarkably simple. It was merely to take over the motion picture business for a grand worldwide propaganda base. In those days, American films dominated 95% of the world's movie screens. We had a weekly audience of 500 million souls. Takeover of this enormous plant and its gradual transformation into a communist gristmill was a grandiose idea. Shortly after his time in Hollywood, General Electric hired Reagan for a CBS segment. Part of Reagan's deal with General Electric included him making public relations visits to General Electric plants throughout the country. These tours went on between 1956 until 1962. And it was during this period that Reagan began to really speak passionately about his beliefs in the free market, communism, increased taxes, and health care, which he viewed as creeping socialism. Reagan's background as an actor, paired with his years of General Electric tours, greatly attributed to his public speaking abilities. His speeches were filled with emotional rhetoric and optimism, and typically lacked real substance and detail. They did not, however, lack popularity, especially amongst fellow right-wingers and evangelical Christians. Now that we've covered some background on President Reagan, I'm going to introduce our second most important character, Yuri Andropov. Yuri Andropov dedicated his entire life to the Soviet cause. During Joseph Stalin's Great Terror in the 1930s, Andropov continued his activism, but kept his head down just enough to avoid the chopping block. This worked out in his favor, and he continued to climb the bureaucratic ladder. In 1967, he was appointed chairman of the KGB, which translates to Committee for State Security in English. This is a gross oversimplification, but for the sake of argument, let's just say the KGB was the Soviets' equivalent of the FBI, but way more intense than the FBI. The same year that he was appointed chairman of the KGB, he was also appointed a non-voting member of the Politburo, which was the Soviet Executive Committee, and later became a full-fledged voting member the next year. His perseverance and subsequent accrual of political clout paid off, and Yuri Andropov succeeded Brezhnev as general secretary after his death on November 12, 1982. Despite the fact that he had held high-profile positions within the Soviet government for 15 years prior to his appointment as general secretary, U.S. intelligence knew very little about Andropov, primarily because he was a very reclusive, very private man. The CIA biographical profile on Andropov that was published on January 11, 1983, and later made public via the Freedom of Information Act in 2015, provided what little insight they had on Andropov. His profile described him as probably better informed on foreign affairs and at least on some domestic matters than any other Soviet party chief since Lenin. It also described him as, by all accounts, his own man and optimistic about détente. Unfortunately, his optimism of détente did not align with President Reagan's aggressive approach to the Soviet problem. One of the most interesting and also incorrect assumptions made about Andropov in his profile was that he appears to be in fairly good health at the present, which he wasn't. He suffered from serious kidney complications, but kept his illness very private. He wanted to maintain his image as a strong leader and not allow the US to paint him as a sickly man to his own people and the rest of the world. Back to Ronald Reagan now. Reagan's hatred of communism festered within him for over 30 years before he was elected president and made itself known in his aggressive approach to the Soviet problem. Because of his outspoken nature and use of inflammatory, if not outright offensive, language, the transition from the Carter administration to the Reagan administration worried the Soviets. Anatoly Dobrynin, who served as the Soviet ambassador to Washington for nearly 2 decades, found himself mortified by Reagan's first press conference as President of the United States. He later reflected that it had been quite impossible for me at that moment to imagine anything much worse than Carter. But it soon became clear that in ideology and propaganda, Reagan turned out to be far worse and far more threatening. This threatening feeling resonated strongly throughout the Kremlin. Very shortly after Reagan assumed office, the Soviet Union created a brand new branch of intelligence known as Operation Ryan, which translates in English to nuclear missile attack. The project was announced in May of 1981 at a major KGB meeting in Moscow by then General Secretary Brezhnev and Chairman Andropov. At this same conference, Andropov justified the creation of this intelligence agency by accusing the United States of actively preparing for war and insinuating that an American first strike seemed likely. The agents moved over for this project generally had previous experience either in the KGB, dealing with domestic intelligence, or the GRU, which dealt with military intelligence. The Soviets weren't the only ones doomsday prepping. In March of 1982, back in the States, the Pentagon ran through their Ivy League 82 exercise, the largest nuclear exercise conducted by them. For the most part, presidents were pretty ignorant about the actual mechanics and procedures involved with initiating a nuclear war, and this ignorance posed a serious threat to national security. Deputy Director of Politico-Military Affairs at the National Security Council, Major Oliver North, realized this and pushed for President Reagan, whose staff he felt coddled him too much, realized this, to participate in this simulation. While it's impossible to recreate the level of stress and anxiety involved in authorizing nuclear war, through repetition of the procedures, the president would achieve the level of detachment necessary to launch. Special Assistant to the President Thomas Reed and National Security Advisor William P. Clark ran through the process with Reagan after he observed a first run-through of the exercise. They opened the nuclear football, which is one of the many nicknames given to the briefcase that holds the PSYOP. PSYOP is short for Single Integrated Operational Plan, which had instructions for directing the US military to fire its nuclear weapons in one orgasmic thump, as one aide later put it to Reagan. The plan called for as much as 95% of all available ICBMs, 20% of bombers, and 66% of nuclear submarines. That's an insane amount of weaponry, and the fact that Reagan was still struggling with terminology pertaining to this situation further stressed the importance of him practicing. After Reagan selected his target based on the circumstances of the simulation, he removed his authenticator, which he kept next to his driver's license and his wallet. In order to authenticate a nuclear order, an emergency actions officer at the National Military Command Center had to open a sealed package that contained the same set of codes in Reagan's wallet. Over the phone, the officer would then read out the codes printed on the left side of the card, the challenge code, and Reagan would respond with the codes on the right side of the card. Just a little fun aside, these authenticator cards were also called biscuits, which I think is really silly and kind of cute. But more importantly, as badass as this sounds, the president's football didn't contain a nuclear war button or anything. It just contained his plan for what would happen. And that plan involved authenticating his identity and then pushing on the rest of the war to the military. After the exercise, Reagan asked Thomas Reed about what would happen to him after the first notification of a nuclear strike. Reed told him that he would be placed in a helicopter heading toward Mount Weather, which didn't work for Reagan, who replied with, "Absolutely not. That's George's job." George being George H.W. Bush, his vice president. He followed up by informing Reed that, "My job is to stay here to try to solve the problem." In the wake of this, one may find it, difficult to doubt Reagan's commitment to his country, his position as commander-in-chief, and his dedication to the anti-Soviet cause. But this prideful captain goes down with the ship mentality sounds courageous in theory, but it would leave the administration with a vice president swearing into office amidst a nuclear fallout crisis with even less preparation than Reagan. I'm sure by now some of y'all are wondering, when's she gonna actually talk about the nukes? You'll be happy to know that we're there. If I had to describe the Soviet government in one word, and one word only, that word would be paranoid. And the placement of American Pershing II and Griffin ground missiles in Western Europe exacerbated this paranoia tenfold. In 1979, NATO agreed that they would deploy American Pershing II and Griffins to Western Europe in order to counter the Soviet SS-20s, which were aimed right at Western Europe. Why were the Soviets so freaked out? Well, aside from the obvious, having nuclear weapons pointed right at them, they were also nervous because American Griffins could fly low enough to avoid Soviet radar. As for the Pershings, the United States publicly announced that their range was 1,800 kilometers. However, Soviet specialists predicted that their range was actually closer to about 2,500 kilometers. A 700-kilometer variance, which roughly comes out to 435 miles, is kind of a big deal. To put this in perspective a little bit for us Americans, that 435 miles would encompass the entire width of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and an additional 50 or so miles into Georgia. It's a lot of land. Coincidentally, though, Poland, which acted as a buffer state, is also roughly about 400 to 440 miles. So was this a genuine concern, or was it a propaganda tactic? Probably a little bit of both. And I have a picture right here. That very tall one is a Soviet SS-20, and the little one next to it is the American Pershing II. And then I also have a couple pictures of the full setup and then a launch for our Griffin ground missiles. In 1981, the Reagan administration announced that they were honoring the 1979 NATO plan to implement these weapons. The Soviets viewed this as an act of aggression and unfair because Western Europe is way closer to Eastern Europe than America is to Eastern Europe, the Soviets weren't the only ones worried, though. Several Western Europeans opposed housing nuclear weapons and opposed the nuclear arms race in general. Others feared that the deployment would increase the probability of war in Europe and felt that it was unfair to drag the United States and the Soviet Union's beef into their backyards. Anti-nuclear peace movements intensified throughout 1983, and it's believed that the KGB potentially funneled upwards of $600 million into these movements. General Secretary Andropov addressed concerns about the arrival of the Pershing and Griffin missiles with the Warsaw Pact heads of state on January 4th, 1983, at a meeting in Prague, Czechoslovakia. In a speech, he claimed that the phenomenon of Reagan and his policies are not only the product of external factors, but also internal causes, such as a fall in production, inflation, mass employment. He instructed the Warsaw Pact to approach the threat of United States policy with all seriousness while maintaining a skeptical attitude towards the United States' success. He appealed to the notions of Soviet benevolence and American stubbornness by claiming that when Reagan entered the White House, he said something in the vein that he, you see, had nothing at all to discuss with the Soviet Union until the USA attained military superiority. But the Soviet leadership acted differently. It confirmed its readiness to conduct a serious, extensive dialogue with the United States. But, of course, a dialogue of equals. He expressed his concerns about the deployment and followed up with an ominous claim that the Soviet Union will know how to respond. Although President Reagan hadn't formally announced his Strategic Defense Initiative at the time of this meeting, the idea of space weapons worried the General Secretary, who had also said, the further expansion of the struggle against the mobilization of space and in favor of its exclusively peaceful use could yield significant political gains. This is a task of truly global significance. The socialist countries have resolutely insisted upon a ban of the deployment of any sort of weapon in outer space. Clearly, we must continue to further expand these efforts, along with concepts in support of such efforts, including in the area of inspections. Eight days after Andropov addressed the Warsaw Pact heads of state in Czechoslovakia, the new chairman of the KGB, Viktor Chebrikov, addressed members of the KGB during a secret speech in Moscow. He maintained that the primary concern of the CPSU and the Soviet Union state has always been, and still is, the elimination of the nuclear war threat hanging over the humankind. Universal peace, friendship, and cooperation between nations. These are our goals. He reiterated that the United States' aims were to undermine the abilities of the Soviet Union and stressed the need to act more decisively in a more offensive mode, and the importance of rising to the new, higher-level quality of work and professionalism in the KGB agency. By this point, there was no doubt in the Kremlin that the United States planned to launch first in this impending, alleged nuclear war. The importance of preparation and intelligence gathering was at an all-time high, since the future and potential survival of the Soviet Union depended on them closely monitoring every action of the United States and NATO that might imply a first strike. On February 17, 1983, Operation Ryan agents received a telegram titled Permanent Operational Assignment to Uncover NATO Preparations for a Nuclear Missile Attack on the USSR. This telegram itself proves that the Soviets not only believed that the United States and NATO planned to strike first, but they actively anticipated it. The agent's orders included uncovering adversary plans for a nuclear strike and reporting any indicators or preparations that might indicate plans to strike. They received a list of 7 immediate and 13 prospective tasks, which specified what they were to watch for. The list of immediate tasks included collecting data about government officials and their families and their evacuation routes, methods, and locations. It also called for the identification of specially equipped civil defense shelters or locations that could potentially be used as a shelter. A watch on individual civil defense installations and surveillance of the traffic of locations associated with nuclear decisions. In the absence of hindsight, these orders seem logical enough. They were also ordered to observe the prices and quantities of blood available in blood banks and watch for changes in the law enforcement system and the activity of special services in regard to Soviet citizens and institutions. The most important part of the prospective tasks included in the telegram called for a detailed description of the nature of measures being carried out in your country of residence by NATO headquarters and agencies, and military installations located there at a time of immediate preparation by the US and NATO for Ryan. Other important tasks included uncovering the lines of communication used for preparation and defining the possibility of finding out with present resources what measures are being taken to bring military installations, which are accessible to our observation. Back to the West again, we have President Reagan continuing what he does pretty well, publicly attacking the Soviet Union. On March 8th, 1983, Reagan, a devout evangelical Christian, delivered a speech at the annual convention of the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando, Florida. His expert use of pathos to connect with his audience and pull them to his side falls somewhat between impressive and horrifying. In the beginning of his speech, he hits on some of the run-of-the-mill evangelical talking points like abortion and prayer in school, and then follows up with an anecdote about a man who had allegedly told him once, "I love my little girls more than anything. I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God." He continued to call the Soviet Union the focus of evil in the modern world, and he warned his audience not to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, and good and evil. Reagan strategically sandwiched his main objective to denounce the nuclear freeze between his evangelical rhetoric and Soviet rhetoric. And this really resonated with his crowd and caused more grief and alarm in the Kremlin. Apparently, Reagan hadn't hit his quota for stressing the Soviets out in that month, because 2 weeks later, he announced his plan for the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, during his address to the nation on defense and national security. He stressed that cuts to his defense budget, the largest military budget to exist during peacetime in American history, would greatly endanger the security of the nation. He called upon the American public to vote for congressmen who supported his defense budget because, in his eyes, the only way America could achieve peace was through military strength. Paradoxical indeed. The climax of his speech came when he vaguely announced his Strategic Defense Initiative by saying, "Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths of technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today." He claimed that due to technological advancements, engineers could build a force field of sorts to block incoming missiles from hitting the United States. Public opinion polls conducted by the Republican Party for the White House initially displayed favorable opinions on Star Wars, but you know who didn't find it favorable? Engineers, the people that would be tasked with building this impossible project. They were pretty much all in agreement that it would cost billions of dollars and take decades to even attempt a partial shield. And at that point, what's the good? While all of this is going on, former American ambassador to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and his wife traveled to Moscow as private citizens with the Department of State-provided translator to meet Yuri Andropov on June 2nd, 1983. Harriman gifted Andropov an autographed photograph of former President Franklin D. Roosevelt and a copy of his memoirs of Our Relations During the War with Stalin. Andropov responded with a prepared statement and warned Harriman that the tensions between the United States and Soviet Union are grounds for alarm, and that this war may perhaps not occur through evil intent, but could happen through miscalculation. Given what historians know now about the Soviet reaction to Able Archer 83, makes this irony really chilling. Andropov followed up by asking about the use of anti-Soviet statements in American campaigns, especially presidential campaigns, and wished that through your lucky hand, it would appear that scholars, diplomats, and others can develop an objective understanding of the Soviet Union. Harriman assured Andropov that the United States wanted to develop and improve relations just as badly as the Soviets did. In a parting note, Andropov emphasized to Harriman that there were good traditions in Soviet-American relations and that the Soviets did not forget them. The gentle tone of this interview was vastly different from the speeches given by Andropov around this time, and his pleas for peace seemed at least somewhat genuine. Although verbal attacks from both sides were hot in the early 1980s, the United States also utilized other methods to distress the Soviets, including psychological operations, or PSYOPs. For the sake of this lecture, we're only going to focus on aviation-based PSYOPs because those are the most relevant. These PSYOPs began around the 1960s, and American spy planes would coast along the borders of Soviet territories to collect intelligence on their communications. But they they mostly tried to avoid actually penetrating Soviet airspace. With Reagan's massive military budget, he also brought in a new era of reconnaissance that was way more risky. He would have he would have people from the Air Force and the Navy receive orders to actively probe the Soviet defense, test out their early warning systems, assess their response times, and measure all of this against US methods of operating stealthily. Many of these missions involve flying directly into Soviet airspace, alerting Soviet air controllers, and zooming right out. These missions succeeded in gathering intelligence and aggressively antagonizing the Soviets. One American reconnaissance mission prompted one of the most tragic events of 1983. The Norwegians had tipped off the National Security Agency about a potential test fire of the brand new Soviet SS-25 missile, and it was projected to land near the Chemkatka Peninsula. The United States Air Force responded to this tip by deploying a Boeing RC-135 heavy jet nicknamed Cobra Ball around midnight on August 31st, 1983. Cobra Ball scouted the international waters surrounding the peninsula in hopes of gathering intelligence, but their efforts were in vain. The Soviets knew about the Norwegians tapping their communications and decided against the test fire. Cobra Ball flew back into its base in Alaska empty-handed, but not without the Soviet Far East Defense Command ground controllers noticing it on their radar. That same morning, about 3 hours later, two commercial Korean Airlines flights, Flights 7 and 15, departed from Anchorage, Alaska, en route to Seoul, South Korea. For unknown reasons, the first of the flights, number 7, veered drastically off path and into Soviet airspace. Some speculate that the cause was fog, while others believe that it was a faulty navigation system. Some even argue that the negligence of the pilot, who may or may not have been visiting with the socialites in first class, including an American congressman, caused the morning's unfortunate events. But the truth of the matter is that we really don't know what happened, and we most likely are never going to know. Nevertheless, Korean Airlines Flight number 7 flew straight into Soviet airspace, which alerted the ground controllers who were already on edge from Cobra Ball. Fearing that the jet might be connected to the American jet from only hours earlier, the controllers attempted to contact Flight 7's emergency frequencies, but received no answer. The radio silenced and thought that a commercial jet couldn't possibly fly so far off its route, convinced the controllers to deem it an American spy jet, and they ordered a squadron after the flight. Senior officer of the Soviet Air Force, Major Gennady Osipovich, received orders to shoot down the jet and obliged by launching 2 air-to-air AA-3 missiles at the commercial flight. The heat-attracted missile hit the left wing of the plane, which caused a fire, while the radar-controlled missile hit the rear of the plane and caused the cabin to depressurize. Once finished, he announced that the target is destroyed and returned back to his base. Between the passengers and the flight crew, 269 innocent souls perished that morning. News of the Soviet shootdown broke in the United States the next day and sparked national outrage. Newspapers, televised news reports, magazines all jumped at the opportunity to weaponize this tragedy. CIA analysts on the other side, they had concluded that the incident was an accident and that the Soviets didn't know that the flight was a commercial flight and genuinely believed that they were tracking an American spy plane. This didn't really work for Reagan, though. He wasn't buying it. Upon learning that the plane shot down was commercial Andropov confided in Ambassador Dobrynin that our military made a gross blunder by shooting down that airliner, and it will probably take us a long time to get out of this mess. Dobrynin later recounted that Andropov was initially planning on coming clean about the blunder, but his defense secretary talked him out of it, which in turn made things worse for the Soviets. In an effort to save face, Andropov issued a public statement on the Korean Airlines incident on September 28, 1983, nearly a month later. He began his statement by attacking Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative and the United States' plans to spread the unrestricted arms race into outer space. Again. Then, instead of taking accountability for his military's massive mistake, he doubled down and placed the blame entirely on the United States and said, "The sophisticated provocation masterminded by the United States Special Services with the use of a South Korean plane is an example of extreme adventurism in politics. We have elucidated the factual aspect of the action in a thorough and authentic way. The guilt of its organizers, no matter how hard they may dodge and what false versions they may put forward, had been proved." This statement is incredibly telling of the Kremlin's mindset by late 1983. The fabrication of this blatant, extreme lie showed just how terrified Andropov was, but he couldn't appear weak to his people and the rest of the world. He followed up with some more of the same old Soviet talking points. Our country is aimed at preserving and strengthening peace, lessening tension, curbing the arms race, and expanding and deepening cooperation among states. And no one should mistake the Soviet Union's goodwill and desire to come to agreement for a sign of weakness. I know that this was a lot of contextual information, but trust me, you'll hopefully understand why after these next few slides. Every year, NATO troops participated in a series of military games known as Autumn Forge. These games lasted several months and consisted of over a dozen different exercises that simulated the initiation of conventional and later nuclear and chemical war between the NATO forces and the Warsaw Pact forces. The logic behind these games mirrored that of the Pentagon's Ivy League exercise in that preparedness stems from repetition. Here I have a couple photos from the actual exercise itself. NATO officials scripted a very detailed series of events for the Autumn Forge 83 role-playing. It began with the transition of power in the Eastern Bloc and the subsequent increase of influence in the Gulf states. This instigated a Middle Eastern proxy war in which the Soviets backed Iran, South Yemen, and Syria politically and militarily. Yugoslavia decides to formally align with NATO, which resulted in the Soviets invading the country and claiming it for the Warsaw Pact. Following the invasion of Yugoslavia, Warsaw Pact forces launched massive air and naval attacks on NATO forces and bases. This initiated the final phase of Autumn Forge 83, Reforger 83. Reforger 83 simulated the transition into conventional warfare. According to the script, the Warsaw Pact forces then upped the ante and launched chemical attacks against NATO forces, and this brings us to today's lecture topic, Able Archer 83. Able Archer 83 was the closing act of the Autumn Forge Games and simulated the transition from conventional warfare to chemical and/or nuclear warfare. This portion of Autumn Forge only lasted 5 days and took place between November 7th and November 11th, and the majority of NATO troops didn't actually participate. According to the 7th Air Division After Action Report, the exercise consisted of 3 days of low-spectrum conventional play and 2 days of high-spectrum nuclear warfare. In the NATO script, the Warsaw Pact chemical attacks began on November 6th, the day before Able Archer starts. On the morning of November 8th, NATO requested permission to initiate nuclear attacks against pre-selected fixed targets. They were granted permission and launched the next morning, November 9th. This initial attack didn't stop the Warsaw Pact. So the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, who acts as the leader of NATO's military, requested permission from Western capitals for the follow-on use of nuclear weapons on November 10th, which was granted. And on November 11th, nuclear war broke out. And just like that, Able Archer and the Autumn Forge Games were done. While NATO forces role-played the outbreak of nuclear war, the Soviets braced themselves for an actual war. According to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Report on the 1983 war scare, the Soviets had implemented military and intelligence activities that previously were only seen during actual crises. The fear that this was the real deal prompted the Soviets to put their entire nuclear arsenal on the maximum state of combat alert. Several Air Force bombers were put on combat alert with a 15-minute standby, and some others were placed on a strip alert, which meant that they were in their jets with the engines running and waiting for orders. Back in America, President Reagan had no idea about the Soviets' partial mobilization. The exact date he found out about this war scare is still debated, but it's a safe assumption that he found out via the December 30th CIA report titled "Soviet Thinking on the Possibility of Armed Confrontation with the United States." The report concluded that, contrary to the impression conveyed by Soviet propaganda, Moscow does not appear to anticipate a near-term military confrontation with the United States. A 1984 Special National Intelligence Estimate tasked with examining the Soviet response to the Able Archer 83 incident drew a similar conclusion and stated that we believe strongly that the Soviet actions were not inspired by, and Soviet leaders do not perceive, a genuine danger of imminent conflict with the United States. Whether it was intentional or not, American intelligence grossly misjudged the severity of this war scare by not attaching sufficient weight to the possibility that the war scare was real. It wasn't until 1990 that the President's Foreign Intelligence Board drafted the definitive account of the war scare to combat the differing views throughout the intelligence communities. This report is also the only report written with access to all U.S. intelligence files on Able Archer 83 and the Soviet responses. The report concludes that in 1983, the United States may have inadvertently placed our relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger. There's little doubt in our minds that the Soviets were genuinely worried about Able Archer, and that at least some Soviet forces were preparing to preempt or counterattack a NATO strike launched under cover of Able Archer. According to the Foreign Intelligence Board, the President was given assessments of Soviet attitudes and actions that understated the risks to the United States. Thanks to the Freedom of Information Act and historian Nate Jones, Thousands of documents about Able Archer are now available online through the National Security Archive, which has made my life so much easier. My biggest obstacle at this point is that I don't know Russian, so if anyone knows any Russians, please talk to me. Examining how the Soviets could possibly believe that the United States would plan for a nuclear first strike during a routine military exercise can be broken down into 5 main points of interest: the Reagan administration's aggressive policies, the rhetoric wars on both sides, Andropov's belief that Reagan doesn't want to cooperate with the Soviets, his anxieties about American missiles in Western Europe, and changes made during the actual Able Archer 83 exercise itself. Andropov had dreams of détente while Reagan championed peace through military strength in hopes of space lasers. The Soviet military couldn't keep up with the United States, and both leaders knew this. Reagan and Andropov constantly smeared each other in their speeches, which only intensified their distaste for each other. Andropov always complained about Reagan's unwillingness to cooperate, but would bash him in the same breath. Reagan was by no means innocent, as we've witnessed. But it's not hard to understand why both of them were so finicky with each other. Although Autumn Forge was a yearly exercise, there were certain procedural changes made during Able Archer that aligned with actual military preparations that alerted the already on-edge Soviets. The exercise was larger than it had been in previous years. Procedures in command, communication, and control changed. Reports of nuclear strikes were made on open-air radio frequencies. Nuclear warheads were transported, and there was a countdown through all DEFCON phases down to general alert. Above all else, it was really just the fragility of Soviet-American relations during the 1980s that's to blame for this entire incident. I've also included a list of suggested readings. These books I've read more times than I can count, and they're all wonderful. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Robeson, our department head, Dr. Soche, my thesis advisor, and my co-author, Dexter, who's my cat. Thank you.